This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Beginning the show is Tyler Cozzens, Director of the Livestock Marketing Information Center, as he discusses a phased reopening of the Mexico border and what will need to be worked through to make it fully possible. Jeff Whitworth, K-State crop entomologist, continues today's show as he chats about cornleaf aphids and sugarcane aphids and what crops they could be causing problems for. A conversation about ducks with K-State fisheries and aquatics extension specialist Joe Gerken ends the show as he says what types of ducks are in Kansas and how people can create suitable environments for them. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Monday show with a cattle market update from Director of the Livestock Marketing Information Center, Tyler Cozzens. Tyler, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Tyler, in the past couple weeks, what announcement have we received from the USDA that could impact the cattle market?
Yes. So one of the pieces of information or news reports that we got from USDA's Aphids, or Animal Plant and Health Inspection Service, came out late Friday, July 24th, and they announced that they are planning to reopen the border between the U.S. and Mexico. The border was essentially closed for about more than a year due to the detection of New World Screwworm in Mexico. So a little bit of a noteworthy news item there that we got a little over a week ago. But a little bit of a brief background on the border closure. Mexico reported cases of New World Screwworm in late 2024, November 2024 specifically. At that time, USDA closed the border and kept it closed for about 2 months. The border was reopened in late January 2025 and remained open until mid-May. The border was once again closed and briefly reopened for 1 week in mid-July, and about 5,000 head of cattle came across the border during that time into the U.S. But ever since that time, the border has actually been closed. So for more than a year, we've seen no livestock imports from Mexico. Now, in USDA's July 24th announcement, they noted that on August 24th, a phased reopening of the border will start. USDA is planning to open the westernmost border crossing with Mexico, and that is the port of Douglas, Arizona. Now, at this time, USDA said that will be simultaneously initiate the operational steps necessary to subsequently open the border crossing at Santa Teresa, New Mexico, and Columbus, New Mexico. USDA also noted that every animal entering the United States through these ports will undergo a full USDA inspection to ensure that they are free of any signs of New World Screwworm. USDA also noted that the reopening timeline will remain flexible, may be adjusted based on Mexico's progress in maintaining action plan milestones and addressing critical issues. Then lastly, for the USDA's news release, they also noted that the opening of ports may be paused if USDA identifies increased risk in Sonora and Chihuahua via post-opening audits or other observations and information. Now, that's kind of a little bit of the background on the report or news release that we got from USDA. Let's dive into a little bit more of some of the background on cattle imports from Mexico. So let's look at some of the historical numbers and kind of look at how many head of cattle were imported typically from those ports along the Mexican border. So specifically, we're going to kind of look at some of those imports of heifers, steers, breeding stock, and roping stock, and specifically look at the years of 2023 and 24 as representative years prior to the border actually being closed due to New World Screwworm. So kind of breaking out some of those trade flows of cattle through those ports, looking specifically first off at Douglas, Arizona. In 2023 and 24, we were seeing about 180 to 190, potentially 200,000 head of cattle coming through just that one port. I do also want to note that Arizona does have another port where we do see cattle come through, and that's Nogales, Arizona. We're seeing about 150, 160,000 head come through there in 23 and 24. So in total, Arizona, we're seeing about 30 to potentially 360,000 head a year come through those two ports there in Arizona. Now, the APHIS did also note that they're going to potentially open up ports in Columbus, New Mexico, and Santa Teresa, New Mexico. Columbus, New Mexico, in 2023 and 24, we were seeing about 135 to 140,000 head come through that one port. Now, Santa Teresa is hands down the largest port where we saw most cattle come through. a couple of years ago, and we were seeing potentially of 530 to about 500,000 head of cattle come through that one port, Santa Teresa, New Mexico. But in total, New Mexico, we were seeing well over 600,000 head per year come through just those two ports. So kind of that Columbus, New Mexico, and Santa Teresa are kind of those key ports that we're watching as far as the phased reopening from USDA. Also wanted to note that there are a handful of ports where we do see cattle come through along the Texas border there. So kind of in total, the number of head that we would see come through Texas on an annual basis would be about 240,000 head. So if we look at it in total, in the last couple of years, 2023 and 24, across those ports along the border, Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas, in total, we were seeing about 1.2 million head come through all of those ports on an annual basis. Now, switching gears here a little bit and talking about those ports again, but also just looking at them on a weekly average basis, as far as the number of cattle that would come through those ports, and still kind of focusing on Douglas, Columbus, and Santa Teresa, because those were the ports that were mentioned. On average, we would see about 3,000 to 4,000 head per week come through that Douglas, Arizona port. Now, if we look at Columbus, similar discussion there, about 2,500 to potentially 3,000 head coming through that Columbus, New Mexico port, typically during 23 and 24. But if we look at Santa Teresa, on average, we were seeing about 10,000 head per week come through that port there in New Mexico. So kind of giving you an idea and a framework as far as potential flow of cattle coming through those three ports. But if we look at kind of on aggregate across all those ports in 23 and 24, we were seeing about 23 to almost 24,000 head come through all those ports prior to the closure there. So give you some perspective as far as trade flows there. So kind of in aggregate, what we're looking for in these coming weeks as we rephase and reopen this border crossings there, if we focus just on Douglas and Columbus and Santa Teresa, we could potentially be seeing about 16,000 head on a weekly basis on a normal year come through from those three ports. Now, will we see that sort of ramp up that quickly? Probably not. We'll probably see more of a phased in approach here, but potentially in the past, what we were seeing is about that 16,000 head per week. So kind of give us a reference to look for as far as weekly numbers potentially coming through those ports. Now, one of the things I wanted to talk about was kind of seasonal trends of cattle imports, right? Kind of give us a bigger picture view and discuss those seasonal flows through those Mexican ports, because that does matter as far as what we might see coming through the rest of this year. Now, seasonally, we're referring back still to those kind of representative 2023 and 2024 years prior to the border closing. I'd mentioned we were seeing about 25,000 head per week through the first quarter of the year. And that's what we typically see as far as a weekly flow of cattle coming through. Now, during the second quarter, imports would actually moderate a little bit lower and average about 15,000 head to about 20,000 head per week. And then typically that seasonal pattern, we'd see a weekly low for cattle imports from Mexico occur during the third quarter of the year, which would dip to about 15,000 head per week. Now, moving into the fourth quarter, weekly cattle imports from Mexico moved higher from the 15,000 head low that we would see to reach a weekly peak of about 30,000 head, kind of in that November going into December timeframe. Now, it's not unexpected that the flow of cattle from Mexico into the U.S. follows a similar seasonal pattern for cattle to be potentially placed into feedlots. But kind of understanding the seasonal flow of cattle imports and placements of cattle into feedlots is necessary, because as we move into August, this would typically be that time when we would start to see more cattle being imported from Mexico and be placed into feedlots in kind of those southern states. A key with this will be how quickly the Mexican producers can pivot and divert cattle supplies from their domestic supply chains and position those cattle to then be shipped into the U.S. This is also along with any adjustments in protocol to ensure that cattle aren't bringing any new world screwworm flies. So a little bit of adjustment there as far as producers and just getting supply flows in place. But keep in mind, this will take some time for producers to make these adjustments. And so watching kind of those weekly flow of cattle imports from Mexico will kind of be that gauge that we need to look for to see the potential cattle numbers that we might see placed into feedlots. So now that we've had some of this discussion as far as just the overall cattle flow and potential numbers that we might see coming from Mexico into the U.S., let's assume we start to see more of these cattle import from Mexico and into the U.S. Likely these cattle will end up being placed in feedlots located in Texas or potentially Arizona, or possibly even Oklahoma or Kansas. It just sort of depends. But in the near term, Texas and Arizona will likely be the states that will see a majority of the cattle imported. This is based largely on the fact that cattle on feed numbers in Texas are below a year ago by about 1% and down about 6% in Arizona. As of July 1, cattle on feed numbers. Oklahoma, Kansas, Colorado, Nebraska, and South Dakota are all above a year ago as far as cattle on feed numbers at the start of July. So kind of looking at just overall cattle on feed numbers, it kind of points to potentially some open pen space in Texas and Arizona. So a little bit of why I'm making that comment as far as just potential placement of these cattle likely going into Texas, potentially Arizona. Now, as the news broke of the potential reopening of the U.S.-Mexico border, we did see some price pressure earlier in the week as the market tried to digest the overall news. Nearby futures contracts actually dipped to a low of about 220 per hundredweight, kind of in that range early in the week. But as the market sort of digested things, we did see a rebound through the week, and actually prices finished the week up about $10 per hundredweight from the start of the week. Fed cash prices also saw pressure early in the week, dipping to 229 per hundredweight, but rebounded by the end of the week, gaining about $4 to about 233 per hundredweight. The market still has to largely digest this news of the border reopening, so prices will be an indication of how the market is factoring in the potential cattle imports from Mexico. Now, we still have to keep in mind that fundamentally, cattle supplies still remain tight and will likely remain tight for the next few years. But the July cattle report that we got a little over a week ago did signal that supplies could be stabilizing, which is a good sign for the cattle sector.
Tyler, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you for having me on. I appreciate it.
That was Tyler Cozzens, Director of the Livestock Marketing Information Center. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show discussing a few pests that are here or making their way here, which are the cornleaf aphids and sorghum aphids, with K-State crop entomologist Jeff Whitworth. Jeff, thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure. Anytime.
Jeff, starting with the cornleaf aphids, and before the interview, you mentioned this pest is already here.
Every year, and then we talk about cornleaf aphids, but we're talking about them in sorghum. It's kind of a misnomer to call them cornleaf aphids because most of the aphids we have in Kansas will get on just about any kind of a grass. And sorghum is the crop we worry about usually, first of all, with aphid feeding because, corn is planted a little earlier and it's usually a little further along, can therefore withstand a little more aphid feeding than the sorghum. Most of the aphids that we have in Kansas, at least the 4 species that sometimes affect corn and or sorghum to the point where they can cause some concern, are aphids that do not overwinter in Kansas. Now, the greenbug traditionally, historically, has been the problem aphid in wheat and or sorghum in Kansas for 40 or 50 years. And for some reason in the last 25 to 30 years, greenbugs have not been a problem. They're always around. You can always go out and find some greenbugs in wheat or corn or sorghum or just about any grass. But for some reason, they have not been a problem. They're not much of a problem in wheat because there's some varietal resistance that works pretty well for greenbugs. But in sorghum and corn, they just haven't been a problem. But they're always there. So there's always a possibility that those populations can explode. Remember, they're aphids. One of the things about aphids, they reproduce without the benefit of the male. That means they reproduce parthenogenically. So that just takes them a lot less time to go from the nymph, very small, young stage, if you will, until the adult where they're reproducing and producing more adults because they're all females. So when the females migrate into the state, and generally speaking, in the last few years, greenbugs come in first. Historically, they were a problem. Now, like I said, they haven't been a problem. And then the second are the cornleaf aphids. Cornleaf aphids, they're pretty noticeable on corn and or sorghum, especially during the whorl stage. That's the only time that I've ever seen them cause a problem. Cornleaf aphids are the ones that are generally kind of a dark gray, maybe kind of a dark greenish color. At least the head is darker than the back of the aphid. When they get into the whorl, they produce a lot of honeydew. And especially in sorghum, they can produce enough honeydew that sometimes the head can't extend up through the whorl. It's just too sticky, or if it does, it interferes with pollination because of the honeydew produced. Now, I've seen that happen on individual plants or a little small area in a field here or there, but apparently this year in a few fields, the cornleaf aphids are migrating in enough that it is more widespread throughout the field. So there's some concern that the amount of honeydew in the widespread area of the field might actually reduce yield. Most of the time, if we're within 7 to 14 days of the head coming out of the whorl, the beneficials will take care of the cornleaf aphids. I have never seen in the 40 or 50 years I've been doing this, I've never seen a field-wide infestation that required a treatment to control cornleaf aphids. That doesn't mean they're not of concern, but generally when they migrate in, they come in from the south. And when they migrate in, generally they start in the south into a field, and they'll just be in a few plants. And they can, stick it up, make enough sticking honeydew that the head won't extrude through the whorl. But that's a rare case. And because they're there, that honeydew, if you go out and you're monitoring your field, normally you'll notice a whole bunch of beneficials, lady beetles, green lacewings, syrphid flies, all kinds of beneficials, because that attracts them. That generally takes care of the cornleaf aphid population in sufficient time that it doesn't bother the head extension. Now, also because of the honeydew, much like the sugarcane aphid that we've just started experiencing in the last 10 or 15 years, they produce a lot of honeydew, but once those aphids are gone, once the beneficials have taken care of them, that honeydew turns, it's not sticky, it dries down and it gets brittle, and it will usually just flake off the plant so that the head has no problem extending up through, or it doesn't interfere in pollination. So that's the cornleaf aphid. Generally grayish, greenish, dark green colonies here or there, but they generally don't cause a problem. The other aphid that has caused a problem in the last 10 years, 15 years is the sugarcane aphid, or the sorghum aphid. It's also migrating in right now. Some of the folks are having a tough time identifying cornleaf aphids from sugarcane aphids, but they're really, if you look at them, especially if you look at them under a little magnification, they're really quite different. The sugarcane aphid or the sorghum aphid is a yellowish color, and it has black tarsi, or black feet, if you will, and two black cornicles on the end. So if you look at them, they're usually a lot lighter colored with little black. The cornicles are the little stovepipes on the end, and they have black feet, if you will. So those are the ones that generally they start out on the underneath side of a plant. They generally come in, it's generally past the whorl stage. Like I said, generally every year is a little bit different. They're here now, but I have not seen any colonize to the point that they're causing a problem yet. They're the ones that from now till soft dough stage will cause concern, because they can colonize quite quickly. There's some good products out there that will kill aphids and help with the beneficials, because they don't bother the beneficials so much. But you want to make sure you need them before you use them, because if you use those, that's just an expenditure when you might have beneficials that are going to take care of the aphids naturally. In the last probably 7 or 8 years, I've looked for populations of sugarcane aphids, and every year I can find a little colony here, a little colony there in a field, and I flag it, go back a week later, and the beneficials have taken care of it. So since 2014, 2015, right in there, I've not seen consistently high populations of sugarcane aphids that have gotten to the point that they require an insecticide application. Now, I'm not saying they don't happen, because they do on a field here or a field there, but I'm talking on a large scale basis like they did back in when we first started getting sugarcane aphids into the state in 2000, can't remember exactly, but 2014, 2015, right in that area. The beneficials that are using the cornleaf aphids right now as a food source. That is really helping them to build up their populations so that it will carry over for the next month or 6 weeks in corn and or sorghum, which can still be vulnerable to aphid attack. But if the beneficials are building up on using the cornleaf aphid populations now, there should be enough there to help, at least help control the sugarcane aphid populations. One of the considerations on sorghum, if you get headworms in there, that's the corn earworm, armyworm, fall armyworm, any of these worms, when they're feeding in the head of the sorghum plant, they're feeding on the marketable product. They're feeding on the grain, the kernel, and you're losing 5% per head per worm. So if you decide you have to spray those, you're going to use a general insecticide, which is probably going to wipe out all the beneficials. And then as we still have these sugarcane aphids coming in, they can populate and they can cause a problem. So that's one of the considerations we always have. But right now, most of the sorghum is just, that I've seen at least, is just approaching the whorl stage or just in the whorl stage. So what we need to worry about, what we need to look for, are the cornleaf aphids and the sugarcane aphids coming in as they're migrating into the state right now. They both produce a lot of honeydew. It is really sticky. That helps attract the beneficials, which helps control the aphids. And as soon as the aphid populations are controlled, that stickiness of the honeydew goes away, so that's not going to be a problem. So just be on the lookout right now for the next 7 to 14 days as the sorghum gets into the heading stage. Be on the lookout for these aphids as they migrate into the state.
You mentioned them migrating into the state, but when will they be leaving?
Well, they leave, or else when it freezes, they die. Okay, they don't affect the crop much after the soft dough stage. These aphids suck the juice out of the plant, so as the plants start to dry down, they'll move from one field to another, looking for younger, more succulent feeding. And if it gets cold in October, November, that's when the migration into the state will cease. Or when the sorghum gets to the soft dough stage, it no longer will affect the sorghum because they can't utilize it as a food source either. So you have a while to go yet before the sugarcane aphid's not a problem.
Jeff, thank you for taking the time to join us today.
Hey, my pleasure. Anytime.
That was K-State crop entomologist Jeff Whitworth. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we conclude our Monday show discussing ducks with K-State Fisheries and Aquatics Extension Specialist Joe Gerken. Joe, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me back.
Joe, what different kinds of ducks could people be seeing in their ponds?
Yeah, there's lots of different ducks, and those ducks really dive down into two different groups. And so the first group of ducks are called dabbling ducks. People also call them puddle ducks a lot. And these are ducks like mallards and teals and wood ducks. And so these dabbling ducks like really shallow habitat. So anything from a few inches to a couple feet deep is really what they like. But these ducks, when they're feeding, they tip their heads down and their rumps up in the air, and you just kind of see them pushing around with their backsides hanging out of the water. And so that's how they are feeding. They're reaching down with their necks, and they're reaching down to the bottom of the pond and feeding. And so this is a good time of year if we're thinking about these dabbling ducks to be managing our ponds. We can do things like drawdowns to expose some different plants, but really a good opportunity for us to be thinking about those shallow habitats. The other group of ducks are called diver ducks. Diver ducks are things like redheads, ringneck ducks, mergansers. And so those are ducks that are going to dive down for food. They're generally more predatory, eating things like fish, mussels, insects, but they're going to dive down and swim around and try to gobble up their food that way.
What type of food are they eating?
That's a good question. Dabbling ducks primarily eat plants and seeds. And so I talked about drawing down the water a little bit. One of the big reasons we do that is that'll allow things like smartweeds or wild millet. People also know that as barnyard grass. Those types of plants grow some really good seeds. And then if we flood those habitats, or if they get flooded later in the year, really good opportunities for those ducks to go in and feed on those. So they're feeding on those seeds. They'll eat some plant material. They'll also eat some insects that they can find. Occasionally, they might eat a small fish or a snail, but dabbling ducks are mainly eating those plants and seeds. The diving ducks, like I said, are eating more of the fish and crustaceans and mussels and things like that.
Can people be creating habitats to hopefully attract these different types of ducks?
Yeah, and one of the big things you can be doing right now is drawing down your pond to those shallower areas where you're creating habitat that's going to make their food. And so a lot of these ducks are going to be going out and finding areas where this food is established. So if you have those areas right now that are in that 6 inches to 2 foot range, that'll help a lot. Some of the other things you can do is allow some of the other plants to grow. And so things like cattails also can provide habitat for ducks to feel safe at night. And so allowing some of those refugia areas can be really important for the ducks as well.
Could they also maybe be preparing to hunt the ducks?
Yeah, I think watching ducks is really fun. Hunting ducks is also a really good opportunity. And so as we're managing our ponds, there's that vegetation I just talked about, the cattails and larger plants that can conceal the ducks can also be really good in concealing humans. So this is a good time of year to get out and look at your pond and figure out other areas maybe that you can access and cut back, but really good opportunity to hunt them. If you are going to hunt them, it's important that you try not to hunt them every day and that you create some refugia habitats, but definitely a good opportunity to get out, manage your pond a little bit for these ducks and these duck hunting opportunities.
What are refugia habitats?
Yeah, refugia habitats are just habitats where, these animals can go and feel safe. And so it might be a nearby pond. It might be a different part of your bigger pond if they, want to go have a safe area that they can hang out. Just an area that they're not getting shot at all the time so that they can feel like they can go have a little safe haven. And then those ducks will come explore into your hunting zone at different times.
And how fast are these things able to fly?
Yeah, ducks can fly really fast, a lot faster than a lot of people think. And so a mallard duck, for example, can fly up to 40 miles an hour. And if they get a tailwind behind them, that might push them to 50 or 60 miles an hour. So really, really fast. That's a good point to point out because when we're out hunting them, we need to lead these ducks a lot more than we think a lot of time. And this is a good time of year to make sure you're getting out and practicing your target shooting and practicing with your guns to make sure that you're ethically harvesting these animals when hunting season's here.
Joe, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thanks for having me.
That was K-State Fisheries and Aquatics Extension Specialist Joe Gerken. That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.